Welcome back to PJ Takes 5. Today is Tuesday, September 2nd, and the first weekend of college football is officially behind us. But we start today with the Monday night primetime game between TCU and UNC, where Bill Belichick lost 48-14 in his college football debut. Very highly anticipated game, probably the highest anticipated game that didn't involve a single ranked team in the AP ranking. Monday night standalone game, something that everyone was looking forward to, with the general thought of Bill Belichick would come in and similar to Tom Brady leaving the Patriots down in Tampa Bay would separate himself from that franchise and show that he has something independent of that group and could lead a different team in a different era with different talent to winning, and that was not the story Monday night in their first showing. So they lost 48-14 to TCU, who's not ranked, but we saw them in the playoffs a couple years ago, so they still have some talent for sure, but not considered a top tier college football team. It was just a night of dysfunction and kind of weirdness for the Tar Heels. Not on the first drive. They had a 7-play, 83-yard touchdown drive to open the game. First drive of the game, first possession for UNC, they looked really clean. Looked like it was an NFL offense with Freddie Kitchens, former Browns head coach, calling the plays there as the offense coordinator. And they marched down the field and took the lead. Quickly after that, the script kind of flipped, and TCU outgained UNC 542 yards to 139 from that point. So a complete dismantling. UNC's defense had no answer for their offense, and on the flip side, UNC just could not get anything going offensively against a pretty stout defense there. So pretty embarrassing showing Monday night for them in their first outing. And it's made worse by some of the external things going on. It's pretty well documented by now, the whole situation with Belichick's girlfriend, the age of some of the players he has out there. And she's wearing her ring from her cheerleading title. She's up there with legends like Michael Jordan and Lawrence Taylor and Randy Moss, a collection of UNC legends, Patriots legends that Belichick knows. And it was all just very weird and kind of non-Belichickian, if that makes sense. Different from what we would see in the past, where everything's very low-key and buttoned up, and this one was kind of a spectacle, whether by intention or not. That's kind of how it ended up looking. Going from the top of the stadium down to the sideline, there's some dysfunction there on the coaching staff between Michael Lombardi serving as the GM, failed GM with the Jets, and now does ESPN work and is kind of straddling that media and executive role with the team, but was really boastful about how this team looked, called them the 33rd NFL team earlier this offseason, and was very confident that they were going to show up and show out, and obviously that wasn't the case. And Lombardi, you have his son on the sideline as the QB coach. You have Belichick's sons, Steve, as the defensive coordinator, and then his other son as the defensive backs coach. There's some nepotism things that are going on that don't seem to be great in hindsight of, is Steve Belichick really the best person to run this defense, or is this just a role that Bill can get his son into and one that he could potentially grow into the head coach within a few years here? So from the field, from the sideline to up in those suites, it was just a night of dysfunction, and one that didn't really shine too brightly on the Tar Heels. Obviously, they were the much more talked about team heading into this game over TCU, and they'll still be talked about after this game more than TCU, more than likely, but in a much different way. So a pretty highly anticipated debut on Monday night that fell short. Moving on down to the rest of week 1 here, a quick recap of Thursday night, where USF took down 25th ranked Boise State 34-7. A pretty embarrassing showing for Boise State, who was a playoff team a year ago. Obviously with Ashton Jeanty doing a lot of the heavy lifting there. USF just dominated physically. We saw a fake punt from USF where they snuck their backup quarterback in and threw a big ball, which went for a touchdown, which put the game out of grasp. A tough thing to see on the field, but also just strategically that opposing team was able to slip something by you like that. And I think Boise State, for me and for a lot of people out there, was supposed to be that non-Power 4 conference champion that would get an automatic bid into the playoffs, and after that first game alone, and obviously missing Jeanty and everything, that doesn't really seem to be the case, and they seem to be pretty far behind some of the potentially other candidates for that role. The other game that Thursday night, Nebraska beating out Cincinnati 20-17 at Arrowhead Stadium. They held off Cincinnati with an interception at the goal line on the final drive. Start with about a minute and a half left. And they started to move the ball a little bit, and then just threw a slot fade, pretty much no read to the goal line. And the safety was able to come over and pick it off. Cincinnati should have probably looked to run the quarterback more. Brendan Sorsby had a pretty good game on the ground with 96 yards and 2 touchdowns. So they probably got a little antsy. There was a little more time at the end of that game there to run the ball a little bit and get into field goal range at least to potentially tie the game. And from the Nebraska side, you look at the Raiola situation. Statistically finished pretty well, 243 yards and 2 touchdowns. It's a little weird that it took 42 attempts to compile those numbers, and they're definitely trying to push that air raid concept where he's going to be the star of the offense. Even though I think their running back, Emma Johnson, is a pretty interesting option. He finished with 108 yards and 25 attempts. A very physical downhill runner that doesn't seem to be aligned with what they're trying to make Raiola into the big time star who compiles all the passing numbers. And I think this offense would be better off if they just kind of became a run first team and then let him play action off of that. And obviously being at Arrowhead with Mahomes in the crowd and everything, the whole Raiola Mahomes stuff was pretty weird. It was looking like him and with the haircut number 15, but then running into the stadium, doing the same dances, doing the same huddles, doing all the small nuances. It's a little weird, and for a guy who's supposed to be as good as Raiola, you would just hope that at some point he can figure out his own personality and into that and grow into that. And copying somebody 10 years older maybe than you is certainly a little weird. So from a personal aspect, I'd like to see him grow past that. From a player aspect, he's obviously nowhere close to the player that Mahomes is, which isn't an indictment. Very few players are, but just from a leadership standpoint, it's weird to be mimicking a guy like that so intently. And the last piece of the Nebraska offense that I thought was really interesting was their tight end, Luke Lindenmeyer, 6'3", 250-pound tight end, so pretty short, relatively speaking, and pretty stocky, but can really move in open space. He had 5 receptions for 47 yards, and it got them down to about the 1 or 2 yard line on a nice catch in the flat where he turned up field. A player who's probably a hair shorter and a hair heavier than what he's listed. I mean, he looks pretty big in that jersey, but for his size, is kind of like a tall fullback, athletic tight end player. He's a pretty interesting player that I want to watch a little more throughout the season. Heading on to Friday there, just a couple more games. We got Auburn beating Baylor 38-24. Auburn's quarterback, Jackson Arnold, an Oklahoma transfer, finished with 137 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns on 16 attempts on the ground, and also put up 108 yards through the air. As a team, they compiled 307 total rushing yards, which is pretty dominant. And then Rayshon Pleasant put up a 98-yard kick return touchdown near the end of the third quarter to put them back up that 14-point differential. So Auburn was ahead of them the entire time. Didn't really let up too much. Arnold, again, wasn't super impressive through the air, but definitely showed off that athleticism, and hopefully that passing attack can develop throughout the year. And then also that night, Georgia Tech beating Colorado 27-20. This game came down to the final drive, which was poorly managed by Deion Sanders and the Colorado staff. The Georgia Tech quarterback, Haynes King, has a 45-yard rushing touchdown with about 67 seconds left, so a little over a minute. When Colorado gets the ball back, they had 2 timeouts, and they were only able to get about 20-25 yards in a little over a minute. So they sat at midfield with 3 seconds left and both the timeouts remaining. So they got to a 2nd and short, I think 2nd and 1, where they decided not to use the timeout, and it ended up draining 15-20 seconds. And then the quarterback had a scramble where he ran up the middle and could have slid, but then decided to run all the way to the left and get out of bounds there. So the clock ended up stopping, but it still cost the team about 10 seconds in doing so. Just really bad clock management. You can't take the timeouts with you, but Sanders and Colorado failed to use them. And then the post-game press conference, when asked about it, Sanders just took no accountability and basically explained away everything, when in reality he could have saved a lot of time by using timeouts in a couple different spots. So definitely not the result they were looking for. Losing Hunter, losing Shador, and then losing a bunch of other people, Shiloh, Horn Jr., a bunch of guys on the offense and defense going to the NFL. Definitely a little bit of a disappointing night for them. Heading on down to Saturday here, which was, the first big slate of college football games, starting with that number 3 Ohio State beating number 1 Texas 14-7. The big story coming out of this game in my eyes was that Ohio State defense, coached by Matt Patricia, they lost a lot of pieces from last season who went to the NFL, and they were able to make a good quarterback. Arch Manning looked very pedestrian. He finished 17 for 30 for 170 yards, a touchdown and a pick, and most of that production came on the final drive or the final 2 drives of that game. They got Arch very uncomfortable with a bunch of different blitzes, sending pressure from the secondary, sending pressure from the linebacker position, getting guys into different gaps, and it definitely made the young quarterback pretty uncomfortable behind the pocket or in the pocket, and kind of resulted in some weird fundamentals at Arch, not stepping into throws and throwing off the back foot and having a bad forward hand when that right arm comes back. So I'm sure they'll get in the lab a little bit and work on some of the fundamentals, but overall just not a great performance from a very highly acclaimed quarterback and one that people were really excited to see. So it's kind of a question of, did we overhype Arch going into this game, or is Ohio State's defense really just that good? And I think in reality, it's a little bit of both. And Ohio State's, going to be a title contender, and Arch still has a ways to go before he can become one of these top Heisman candidate quarterbacks, which isn't anything too surprising. I mean, Eli and Peyton, his uncles, weren't world beaters out the gate for their respective schools. So, this isn't saying that Arch can't become a number one pick or a top 5 pick or whatever in the NFL eventually. It just might not be Baker Mayfield, Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels asking numbers right away here in his first year. And then on the other side, looking at their new quarterback, Julian Sayin, who played pretty good. Definitely not great. Again, Texas is another team that has a pretty good defense, and obviously they couldn't do enough to pull off the W in Columbus there, but they played pretty well, and Ohio State's offense looked good, but not great, which I think you'll take at this point in the season with a freshman quarterback and a defense that was lights out all day. I'm sure Ohio State's going to jump up to the number 1 team here. Going to the other big ranked game on Saturday here, number 9 LSU taking on number 4 Clemson, 17-10 at Clemson. So going into that Death Valley and winning was super impressive. Another game where the defense really shined for the winning team there. So LSU's defense was able to neutralize Cade Klubnik, a really good quarterback, who finished 19 for 38, 230 yards and a pick. And then the Clemson rushing offense was shut down as well with only 31 total yards on the ground. So both teams played fairly well. I thought it was a little different than that Texas game where, the Texas offense really struggled. I thought both these teams in this game looked pretty good and showed why they should be ranked top 10, top 15 in the nation. Obviously, only one team can win, so it came down to the last play of the game, essentially. If these teams were to meet again at any point in the playoffs, I would imagine that it'd be a pretty similar showdown down to the wire. You look at the end there and you look at LSU's defense, and they were really abusing that man blitz concept where you get after a quarterback and you lock up the receivers, especially on the outside, and they were really productive with that, especially once Clemson even got into the red zone situation and the space shortens and you can be a little freer with knowing that you don't have to cover up 20, 30 yards behind you. So it was a really impressive outing from LSU's defense, especially at the end there. And then it's a notable game because it's LSU's first Week 1 win since 2019, which of course is in the national championship squad with Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson and just a load of guys who went on to the NFL. So I know there were questions about Brian Kelly's ability to win in Week 1, which he hasn't been able to do here recently, but really good win for the Tigers there to go into Clemson and come back victorious against a team that was ranked top 5 in the preseason ranking. So moving on down here to another top 10 team that lost, Florida State taking down number 8 Alabama 31-17 at Florida State. So got the home field advantage, and we saw the first glimpse of transfer quarterback Tommy Castellanos from BC, now at FSU, and he really loved that Seminole offense in a pretty spectacular way. So the passing game was a little pedestrian, 9 for 14 for 152 yards, so didn't get a lot of shots through the air, but he led the team with 78 rushing yards and punched it on the ground, and he led that offense to 230 rushing yards. You look at Alabama, they just had 87 throughout the entire game, so controlling the line of scrimmage for Florida State, and then having a quarterback behind there who can make the right reads and not lose you games against a talented but very flawed Alabama team was a very good thing to see for Florida State as they look to rebound off of a really poor year last season. And just beginning to end, Florida State was the much more physical team, especially on that line, like I mentioned, with those running stats. Alabama's defense, they looked to be in a little bit of trouble. Talented guys, highly rated guys coming out of high school, but the fundamentals were off and the tackling downfield was off and the hustle to the sidelines was off. They just seemed to be lacking a lot of what made them Alabama during the Nick Saban days, especially on the defensive side of the ball, especially in that secondary area. So a lot to regroup for Alabama. Obviously the season's far from over, but if they want to get back into a playoff situation or a spot to compete for the SEC title, they got to figure some stuff out fast in that defense, because these other teams in the SEC, they're coming pretty fast here. The one thing for them, I thought their offense was relatively impressive. They were playing behind all games, so that changes a couple of things and probably impacts some of those rushing numbers we were talking about. But I thought their quarterback, Ty Simpson, actually looked pretty good. Finished 23 for 43, 254 yards and 2 touchdowns. And like I said, a lot of that's in situations where the defense knows you're going to pass anyway, so it's a little even harder at that to have that production. But we saw receiver Journey Bernard finish with 8 receptions for 146 yards, and Ryan Williams, the star returning player, super young receiver, only ended with 30 yards on 5 receptions, so probably got to look to get him a little more involved going forward. But overall, just a really tough look for Alabama out the gate, and one that's going to have people hammering for Kalen DeBoer's job and asking the question of, is he the right guy to take over and be that guy after the guy, which is a very unenviable position, but one that he has found himself in and has to perform a lot better and to keep that job, because Alabama is one of those places where if you're not winning, no matter what the buyout is, no matter what the contract looks like, they're going to try to get you out of there and bring somebody else in. So, for their coach, they got to get him going pretty soon here. And then the last game from Saturday I have here, just real quick, number 17 Kansas State staving off North Dakota 38-35. So Kansas State's ranked 17, even after losing that game versus Iowa State in Dublin in week 0. So the AP poll didn't update after week 0 before week 1. So they're going to move a lot up or down here, but they needed the final drive of the game to beat North Dakota in a very close game. Strong statistical showing from Avery Johnson, similar to how he had in Iowa State, where the numbers look good, but something just feels off the entire time. Obviously, North Dakota, an inferior opponent, and one that you should be able to take care of pretty quickly here if you're a top 25 team in the country. So definitely a head scratcher, and we'll see where they lie in this newest AP poll. Heading down to Sunday here, we got just 2 games we'll try to go through pretty quickly here. 13 South Carolina beating Virginia Tech 24-11. The big story here was quarterback Lenore Sellers for the Gamecocks and his main receiver Nick Harbor, and these two have a very good chance to be a special connection here in college. The book was kind of out on Sellers dating back to last year, where he came on pretty strong at the end of the season. But on Sunday, he finished 12 for 19, backed on 13 carries for 234 total yards and 2 touchdowns, one through the air and one on the ground. And then Harbor, his main receiver, had 3 receptions for 99 yards and a touchdown, a 64-yard touchdown in the second half. The thing with Harbor, he's a big, fast receiver who's physical and has some weight to him, but he did have a couple simple drops throughout the game, so just getting those two in better connection with the simple stuff I think will help that offense a lot, and they look pretty scary in their own right against a Virginia Tech team that I thought was actually fairly decent throughout the day. You know, they didn't score a touchdown all day, but I thought their offense had some interesting stuff working. Their quarterback, Kyron Jones, had 2 not amazing interceptions, but I thought looked pretty good, all things considered. Airmailed a would-be touchdown early in the game on a scramble drill where his receiver went deep and he just threw it maybe a yard or 2 past him. His receiver, Green, number 0, was also pretty impressive. I thought they had a pretty good connection throughout the game. But Virginia Tech, not a team that anybody expects a lot out of this season. I thought they played pretty well, so against a superior opponent. So definitely some optimism there. And then heading on to the Sunday night game, number 10 Miami taking down number 6 Notre Dame 27-24. Potentially the best game of the weekend. You look at the end of the first half, Miami's CJ Daniels one-handed touchdown grab, potentially play of the year already. I know it's just week 1, but it was a crazy catch for the LSU transfer to get into the end zone, and you saw Notre Dame's safety just ready to pick that ball off, and Daniels was able to snatch it out of thin air. Another crazy play, Reuben Bain Jr., DN for Miami, had an interception on a screen pass where the ball got tipped in the air, and then a Miami DB tipped it again with his foot, and then the DN came all the way out and caught it and got a couple yards on the return. Another just crazy play. And then this came down to the very end where Notre Dame had the ball with a little over a minute left, but with those strong Miami DNs, Bain Jr. and then Akeem Messidor, dogs with their ears pinned back. It was a really tough situation for Notre Dame's O-line, who was gassed at that point to stay strong in there, and Carr, who had a pretty good game, just could not avoid the pressure, and the closers on that D-line for Miami were able to get the job done at the end there. So they're looking pretty tough. You can't talk about this game without saying that Carson Beck had a pretty good performance. 20 for 31, 205 yards, 2 touchdowns, no picks. really just, putting his name back on the map as a player who can really lead a team and isn't necessarily the product of good talent around him. Although obviously Miami has a bunch of really good players, but probably the MVP of the game, if not one of those defensive guys like Bane. And then from the Notre Dame side, they look pretty good. Had some good playmakers out there. I thought the receiver Faison is really strong and a player that's hard to take down on one tackle, but the biggest question mark for them was their usage of Jeremiah Love. 59 total yards on just 14 total touches. Probably not quite enough. I know he hurdles a lot and moves a lot with those touches, so you feel like he's giving it his all. Weirdly, I felt like they were maybe saving him for the end of the season. Obviously, they had a deep run last year and he was banged up throughout. I don't know if that was part of the game plan of trying to preserve him a little bit for the end of the year here, but certainly didn't use him enough, and he's probably the best player on that offense, and to only have him touch the ball 14 times at the running back position was miss in my mind. So obviously, they were down significantly in that second half, so it's hard to run the ball and be committed to that, but getting him involved more would have been good to see. So that's our recap. I will say, going back to the 4 picks I had last weekend, and I'll do it again this weekend, but I did go 0 for 4, so that's why I said at the beginning that I'm definitely not a gambling expert, and that wasn't advice or financial advice, but just my pick. So I would say it is almost more impressive to go 0 for 4 than 4 for 4 if you think about it, but the good thing is this weekend I literally cannot do any worse in college, and then I'll also do 4 picks, the over-under, favorite, and dog for the NFL game. So from here on, while college and NFL is happening, there should be 8 picks a weekend, but first weekend 0-4, just a good reminder getting into the college football season that I don't know what I'm talking about more than anybody else does or doesn't. So, like I said, it will be better this weekend, and we'll get our first win in there. So moving on down here, we got Coach Lee Corso, turning in his last performance on College Game Day. They sent him off. He went 6 for 6, picking Tennessee, South Carolina, Florida State, Miami, LSU, Ohio State. And he wore that Ohio State Buckeyes mascot, the same one that he wore all those years ago to kick off that tradition that he does. Turned 90 less than a month ago. He's looking good for his age, but just wanted to step back, and it's more understandable. He was honored earlier this summer at the ESPYs with a cool marching band performance, I believe, by USC. And then this weekend, Ohio State's best damn band in the land spelled his name out during the halftime march, so I thought that was pretty cool. And then the other big note was that all the teams that he coached, FSU, Maryland, Navy, Louisville, Indiana, Northern Illinois, all won this past weekend on his send-off weekend. So just one of those guys who's become synonymous with the coverage of a certain sport and a certain sport in itself, and everyone remembers waking up Saturday morning to watch him and that crew do all their picks, and ultimately to see him make his pick and do the wave and all the funny moments that he had. Definitely good to have turned into that, and a guy who's definitely going to be missed throughout the rest of the year here and years going forward. So just wanted to give Coach Corso a little shout out there. Heading down to some NFL injuries that came out here ahead of the first weekend of NFL football. We'll start with Micah Parsons, the man who just got traded from the Cowboys to the Packers here for 2 first-round picks and defensive tackle Kenny Clark. He was limited in practice on Monday with the Packers due to some back stiffness. He's got a facet joint sprain in between his L4 and L5 vertebrae. That's holding him out of practice here. He potentially could be able to go on Sunday, but might potentially need a injection to kind of that situation a little bit, but they're looking to get him on the field as soon as possible, obviously after trading for him and having a big divisional opponent this Sunday against the Detroit Lions. So he received some treatment with the Cowboys, I believe some prednisone pills during the last days that he was with that team. But again, they're still not sure if he's going to be able to play in the opener, and I'm sure the team wants to see him out there, and he wants to get back out there and prove what the Cowboys lost and him on the field. But the situation to monitor, as one of the best players in the NFL, is questionable for that debut on Sunday. Another really important player in the NFL, quarterback Matthew Stafford for the Rams, expected to start the season opener per Coach Sean McVay. Another back injury, aggravated disc in his back, missed the entire preseason and about a month of training camp, so was able to practice at the end there, but has been a full participant over the last 2 or so weeks. But a situation that NFL fans have watched closely, and we've heard differing timelines on when he'll return, and it seems to be looking like week 1, we're going to see him behind center. And I know on the kind of meme side of sports following and sports coverage, there's the narrative that he died and has been replaced, and obviously that's not true, but the Rams are a very good team with a good defense and some good skill position players, and Stafford's kind of a big question mark, which is weird because he's the veteran leader on that team. But if he's healthy and can play the entire season, that might be the NFC representative in the Super Bowl. And if he has problems and can't play 10 games, they could be one of the worst teams in the NFL and be picking in the top 5 looking for, a Lenore Sellers or Cade Klubnik or Garrett Nussmeier or whoever out to draft. So I'm really high on the Rams and a lot of the players they have. But like I said, if they go as Stafford goes here in his later years as quarterback, so hopefully he can start for week 1 and stay healthy there behind center throughout the year. Another player in Los Angeles there, Najee Harris, the free agent signing for the Chargers this year, expected to play in the opener after that eye injury, so sustained an eye injury in a fireworks-related incident close to 4th of July. Has not been a full go in practice until this past week. Coach Harbaugh remains non-committal on whether or not he will be available week 1. They also drafted Omarion Hampton back into the first round there, but Harris, a player that they probably want to be able to establish that downhill running game, and both those players can do that, but Harris is certainly the veteran at doing that. So it'll be interesting to see if they have their running back room at full strength heading into the season. And then another California name, on Jennings, practicing for the first time in 36 days on Monday. The calf injury in last practice late July the 27th, and is also seeking a new contract after finishing last season with career highs in receptions, yards, and touchdowns. So maybe a situation where it's more about the contract, maybe a situation where it's more about the injury. Potentially both are happening, but they're going to look and try to get him ready to go by week 1. And they have a pretty depleted wide receiver room with Brandon Ayuk set to miss some time, and Ricky Pearsall as really the only other highly touted receiver in that group. So getting Jennings back should be helpful for Brock Purdy, who right now really only has Pearsall and George Kittle at that tight end position to lean on. So he could potentially be back for week 1, which would maybe mean that he has a new deal, but it certainly would mean that like half is healthy. Last subject here, we got the Cubs. With football starting, kind of dipped in the Cubs a little bit, but just wanted to do an update. They had lost 4 of the last 6 to end their West Coast trip in the 2 series against the Giants and the Rockies. So Monday was the first game home since August 21st, and they won 7-6 against the Braves in 10 innings. Undisputed hero of the game was Carson Kelly, the catcher, game-tying 2-run homer in the 8th, and then a walk-off RBI single in the 10th to win it. In extra innings, Ian Happ finished the day 3 for 5 with a homer, which is his 3rd homer in the last 4 games, so he's pouring it on here in recent games and recent outings. Dansby Swanson brought in 2 RBIs, and then Matt Shaw, 2 out of 3 with an RBI too. So we've seen Kyle Tucker and PCA and Seiya Suzuki work out those funks a little bit here throughout July and the latter parts of August, but the production from some of these less heralded guys, Carson Kelly and Ian Happ and Dansby, Matt Shaw, Nico Horner, some of these guys who aren't necessarily expected to be the big-time offensive players, consistent guys, it's been really helpful as they've come through the stretch. So they now find themselves 5.5 games behind the Brewers entering Tuesday, after they lost yesterday to the Phillies, I believe 10-8. So the Cubs have, I believe, the 4th easiest schedule remaining, and the Brewers about middle of the pack with the 16th hardest schedule. So definitely space over the next month to try to catch that number, and they're pretty firmly in the 1 seed for the wild card spot, but to potentially catch the Brewers and win the NL Central would definitely be a better way to finish the season than entering the postseason as a wild card team. And then a couple moves that they pulled off since the end of August here: signed first baseman Carlos Santana, not the musician but the first baseman, after he was released from the Guardians, so he's going to be a depth piece that could play first base behind Bush or Justin Turner potentially, or could play in the outfield maybe. They claimed right-handed pitcher Aaron Zavala from waivers, who was released by the White Sox, and he actually played on Monday, 3 innings pitched, and just had 1 hit allowed and 4 strikeouts, so pretty strong performance in relief there of Colin Ray. And then they recalled Porter Hodge from the Iowa AAA team, and called up Kevin Alcantara and sent down Owen Casey in a corresponding move. So the handling of Casey still seems a little bit weird to me. Obviously, Ian Happ's got the no-trade spot in left field, and PCA is going to be around for a while, and Cal Tucker's still a question mark with the re-sign, but, they pulled him up and then didn't do a lot with Casey in his little stint there, and now he's getting sent back down. So I hope they can re-sign Tucker and maybe the left field is the place where you try to put Casey and figure out something else for Hap. I don't know what it looks like in 2026 here, but it was certainly a weird spot for Casey to be in over the past couple of weeks. So like I said, the Cubs got the Braves this week, and then they'll continue with one of the easier schedules over baseball and try to catch the Brewers, who have faltered a little bit from their just insane run throughout July and August. That's all the baseball stuff I have. Today's show will preview the NFL season, and I'll do some games coming up for both college and NFL, but also all the NFL awards and some record predictions, and then I'll get my over-under favorite dog picks for both leagues. We'll do better than we did this weekend and enjoy week 2 of football and the first week of the NFL weekend. So I'm really excited. Just did a couple of fantasy football drafts this past weekend, which all turned out well, but football's upon us, and I'm excited to talk about it. So I'll see you guys then. Peace.